So I'd like to introduce our moderator for this Space Power panel, Dr. Peter Gerritsen. Peter Gerritsen is a senior fellow in defense studies at the American Foreign Policy Council and a strategy consultant who specializes in space and defense. He is the co-author of Scramble for the Skies, the great power competition to control the resources of outer space. And he is the host of the Space Strategy podcast, which is a great podcast. I recommend you check both of those out. Joining Peter on the stage for this Space Power panel is James Winter. He's on the stage, Nikolai Joseph and Casey Durad. And then virtually we have John Bucknell joining us, and also Sanjay Vangendran is with us virtually as well. So I will turn it over to the panel, and after this panel, we will be having a break. So thanks for your participation.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be on a panel that is something that is fundamentally about in-space assembly and manufacture, as well as something that attempts to go after the great challenges of today. And as you've heard, we've got a phenomenal panel. And so I'm going to start with James Winter, who is the program manager for Air Force Research Lab's SPIDER program. Please lead us off.
Okay, well, let me start by saying it is a pleasure to be here, and also a pleasure to be inspired by the keynotes. We have some exciting work ahead of us, and it's great to do that. So if I could get that first graphic up, Andrew. So I'd like to start with a graphic. And because we always know that that an image has, is worth 1,000 words. And what you see depicted there is what we're vectored toward. And that is the challenge that came, is to develop the technologies to enable a space-based power beaming concept, and develop those technologies and look at it. So what you're seeing there is a government reference design for 1,000 square meter aperture. Let that soak in a little bit. 1,000 square meters. That's like a quarter acre. And also, when we started looking at this, we said, well, okay, well, what's our point of departure? What has been built to date? And we find out we hadn't even broken the meter squared threshold. And when you look at the folks that have worked in power beaming over the years, they want to get to 10 to the 5th, 10 to the 6th. So this is an orders of magnitude endeavor that required starting to get to a meter squared. So in our acronym SPIDER, it's basically the context of power beaming. People have spent their decades or careers working on that. But in order to achieve that, we broke it up into incremental demonstrations and research that underpin achieving 1,000 square meters. What's unique in AFRL's application for this is that it's direct conversion, photons to microwave to RF, and thus the little graphic. So everything is condensed into that little graphic, including the goals. But since I had that opportunity to describe to you 1,000 square meters in space, I'm just curious. We find out people react. You can distill the reaction in two different ways. People are either excited and say, how can you do that? Or their first reaction is, no way, you can't do that. So as a show of hands, since this is somewhat of a workshop, how many of you fall into that first category of, wow, how can you do that? Okay, and how many fall into that second category of, no way, you can't even do that? Well, then we have some undecideds, but asking, not convincing yourself it can't be done, but asking, how can we do that? Assume it can be done and do it. So that's why this graphic is important, and basically distills the whole program. If we go to the next slide, like I said, the goal is just to rapidly infuse technological innovations to achieve that. And that's what we've been focused on in the past few years. So AFRL's approach wasn't no way, we can't do that. The approach was to understand state of the art. The approach was to disaggregate the risk and formulate a portfolio of activities that have basically two major thrusts, and that is integrated demonstrations, that's the ID and SPIDER, and also research, or what we also call critical technology elements. Energy generation, large deployable structures, which also is very amenable to in-orbit assembly, beaming, thermal, and metrology. So I can tell you, everything that we have been done is with that North Star vision of achieving 1,000 square meters. Cognizant that that's 2 orders of magnitude short of where we ultimately want to go to, but we thought, 3 orders of magnitude, that's a good place to start. So that is how we got at SPIDER, recognizing the payoff of a space solar power system, but trying to achieve a meaningful goal, ambitious, with the incremental demos and research. So a portfolio that is amenable to I think Robbie mentioned it, performance within cost. Another way to think of that is performance within constraints, or performance within time, talent, and treasure. So at the lab, we're very good at that. We were given big goals, and we modulate and fit within those constraints in the past few years. Okay, next slide. So first graphic, 1,000 square meters of aperture with the goal of mass manufacturing, a goal of scalability. So one of the unique things when you talk about a direct conversion solar to RF, it's amenable to scaling because they're standalone units. They're also so you can architect systems based on that. So each system, it's a progression from a tile to a panel to an array. What you're showing you here is a graphic of a panel, which will be we're actively building. We've actually shown in the lab light to RF on a tile level. This is the next step in that progression to 1,000 square meters, and this is what we call a panel. This panel will be flying in low Earth orbit. It's on a integrated flight experiment that we've called Arachne. And so we will validate and fully characterize that panel and then validate our models to move forward. So all that to say is it's good to have ambitious goals and to understand them in the context of how they fit in the big picture. We've started and we're making real progress towards demonstrating this with the goal of seeing it be able to be amenable to mass manufacturing, scalability, and in all the ilities we're encouraged to think about. So I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot of what we've been up to. And it resonates very well with some of the near-term goals that we put in one of the earlier reports. And we're well on our way. And we're able to modulate what we want to do toward that end within that constraint of performance within time, talent, and treasure. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much. So, something unthinkable is sort of happening today compared to a few years ago. This is not the only space solar power panel happening right now in the world. So as we speak, Australia is having a panel on how their government wants to posture itself for space solar power. And ESA is busy doing things over in Europe. And so we are very lucky to have Sanjay Vivendran, who is the lead for the European Space Agency's Solaris initiative. And Sanjay, are you online? And can you tell us a bit about Solaris?
Sure. Solaris initiative, which is the first dedicated research and development initiative at the European Space Agency on space-based solar power. This topic is not a new one for the agency, like other agencies around the world. It's been studied on and off over the last decades. But this is the first time that we are really embarking on a intensive 3-year effort to understand, with deep technical studies as well as technology development, the credibility of space-based solar power as a source of clean energy for Earth. So as a civilian agency that invests in the uses of space for civil use, we are coming at this from the angle of the ability of the utilization of space and space technology, and in particular space-based solar power, to help with mitigating climate change. That is what is driving our efforts now with investigating space-based solar power through the Solaris initiative, so that we can make a decision in a few years from now, and not too far away because of the urgency of the crisis, about whether this can be a potential contributor to our clean energy goals here in Europe, and support more widely around the world the decarbonization of societies. And so we would like to make a future decision in an informed way, and the purpose of Solaris to take us to 2025 is to provide the foundation of that informed decision making with real hard data on the table through technology development, around demonstrations as well, and understanding the business case essentially for this as a new energy source in our future energy mix. So that's what we've just embarked on. The initiative was approved at ESA at the end of last year, and we've just kicked off in the last few weeks our first set of system study activities with two contracts with European contractors to look at what would be an up-to-date reference architecture for commercial scale space-based solar power plants. It's something that we haven't done in Europe, these sorts of technical studies, for over 20 years. So we are looking forward to taking a fresh look approach, of course, taking into account all the good work that has been done internationally on this topic in the US, the UK, China, and elsewhere on system concepts for space-based solar power, but bringing in some European thinking and technology as well into this topic now, to come to the end of this year. We're conducting this in an intensive way as well. Come to the end of this year with some new reference architectures which we can take forward. Interestingly, these two studies are taking slightly different approaches to how to deliver the power from space to Earth. So what you saw James Winter described earlier about beaming power with radio frequency, but this is the favored choice of delivering power for space-based solar power concepts for Earth applications in many studies. But one of the ways that you can deliver power down as well is simply through reflection of sunlight using giant orbiting mirrors. Now, there are some advantages to this, particularly the simplicity of the structures that you need to put up in space, where you don't have to convert the power to electricity and then beam it down with antenna, but just have lightweight mirrors that can reflect sunlight onto existing solar farms. So this is also an old idea. It's not new. Has been even demonstrated as a techno demonstrator some time ago in space, but we are going to be investigating that as an alternative approach to the let's say more conventional radio frequency beaming approach. And this will have different applications because it is of course weather dependent. It would be blocked by clouds, but there are some markets, some applications where such a simpler approach might already provide a nearer term business case while we work on a longer term application of the radio frequency approach. So as I said, this is going to be a 3-year effort on this European Space Agency side to try to de-risk the technology, get the information together to make a future decision, but at the same time, through our investments in Solaris, to build an ecosystem in Europe of companies, academia working on space-based solar power, which is something that is, for some critical areas like wireless power transmission, still relatively immature on the European side. And so we hope that our investments will encourage established companies as well as new companies and startups to get into this field, which have a wide range of applications as we move down the road towards the longer term goal of gigawatt power stations beaming power from orbit to the Earth. So with that, I'll conclude here, and happy to take further questions on our efforts later. Thanks.
Thank you, Sanjay. And now we're going to hear from John Bucknell, who is the CEO of Virtus Solis, which is a US-based commercial company pursuing space solar power. John?
Morning, everyone. Again, my name is John Bucknell. I am the CEO of one of the few commercial entities operating globally in this space. We're about 4 years old as a business, but we are developing a commercial space-based power solution. My background, I worked at SpaceX a decade ago and was one of the original developers of the Starship vehicle and its rocket engines. And we realized a few years ago that the convergence of low-cost space launch, Moore's law, and the power electronics development of semiconductors, as well as modern automated manufacturing, has enabled space-based solar power as a solution globally. And we are on our path to delivering a first commercial system by the end of the decade. As part of that development, we have done a number of technology demonstrations, including one most recently this March, where we demonstrated the longest distance microwave wireless power transfer system that we are aware of. We're operating at a 10 gigahertz frequency, which is we share with all the domestic programs, including the programs at Caltech and the Department of Defense, with the intention of being able to deliver power to the ground at very long distances at very high efficiency. It has not been known until very recently with very large apertures on orbit, and we're talking about systems that are similar in size to what the Air Force Research Lab project aspires to, 0.5 kilometer to many kilometer transmit apertures. You can deliver energy very efficiently from orbit to the ground. So that enables our business case and allows us to pursue capital funding from private and as well as sources to develop this technology. And we'd be happy to describe our approach and our efforts later on in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And now we've got Nick Joseph, who is a policy analyst, currently detailed to Goddard, but who was at the NASA Office of Technology, Policy and Strategy, and I think was probably the most recent government person to do serious modeling of space solar power, and perhaps you've reached some personal conclusions about that.
So Pete just asked me if I could be up here yesterday, so I didn't have any prepared comments or anything cleared. And I want to be clear that this is my perspective. This study that we embarked on last year is not complete, so I can't really talk about what we found in it. But in doing a comprehensive look across space solar power and what has gone on in the US and worldwide over the last 20 years, we did learn quite a bit. We were on the lookout for where things have evolved over that time period, and immediately ran into the ESA team and have become, not just colleagues, but friends with Sanjay and his team, and tracking what they were doing and understanding where there was activity worldwide. When I first started looking at space solar power like 10 years ago, it was dormant is not even a sufficient adjective, right? It was ice cold, and it is completely really care for the naming, but it is interesting. And seeing both the adoption of approaches like versus how that is integrated into activities like the Caltech research, and how the Caltech research is moving into stuff like the SPIDER program, and comparing that to some of the larger, I'm going to say more monolithic approaches that we see in the Cassiopeia design and the legacy of the ISPS Alpha. Watching it shift from the large single constellations or single units into more of a constellation-based approach has been a fascinating shift that I don't think was possible, or people were real seriously considering 20 years ago when NASA last looked at this. And so looking across everywhere, the government and looking internationally, but then also looking into NASA and seeing what we were doing that might be relevant. So power beaming is not really a topic that has been talked about much. It's coming up again in terms of lunar activities, lunar surface activities. It might be better to beam power than it is to run cables. But the space solar power approaches have not really found their way into the modeling. People aren't really looking at this in the trade space. Partly, I think, because of a lack of reference designs. There's, if we're talking about gigawatt scale systems, we don't need gigawatts on the moon, right? And that's where NASA's core interest is. We looked at it from the perspective of, does this fit to our national climate goals as a framework for thinking about it? Does this help someday with achieving a lower or zero carbon future? In that, the space solar power found a natural place in the discussion. I think that's part of the renewed interest. I hope that's part of the renewed interest. And learning also about how the ESA team and Sanjay, how they saw the energy markets shift in the past year and a half, and getting a sense that we're probably not entirely insulated from that either. And so things like space solar power and fusion definitely ring a little bit differently, and a shift in our national posture towards climate change and what we may or may not do about it, it creates an opening, and at least an opening for consideration. And yeah, thanks.
All right, so I'm going to give Casey just a little bit more of a setup beforehand. I'm going to ask a couple of questions of our other panelists before she does her reveal. So, I want to start with James. One of the things I know we talked about early is the potential of a project like this to have a positive impact on the space industrial base. So I'd like your thoughts on that.
Well, what we found is we broke up the problem into critical demonstrations and actually started building hardware. So with an Apollo-like goal or a North Star vision and everything vectored to that, it just ultimately comes down to magnitude of that vector, right? So that gets back to that performance within constraints idea. As we've looked at each of the CTEs or the R in Spider, we are seeing phenomenal and very exciting developments in each one of those that are applicable across the whole enterprise. And we're also seeing the fact that that those will spin off, and those will help other projects. And so there's fruit from that. And what's been exciting to see since we first were here a few years ago is now the interest and the catalyzed interest in other folks tilting at this problem in a real way. And I say real way, meaning that they have those resources to pursue that. So I think we're at a tilting point where we're going to see some real progress, because you're building hardware and validating models. And one of the things I've learned is the sooner you can get to building hardware, the sooner you can iterate on it. One of the first things we had to do is make specialty RFICs for the conversion. And you know what? The first thing, the result after they analyze it is, we could do better. Give us another. Let's do another spin. We don't have that luxury. We're want to get the answer is I think you're going to see the catalyst of a lot of activities that are going to make its way out into the industrial base. And I can tell you there's a whole plethora of activities that are starting to bear fruit within the CTEs and even the demos that we've initiated.
Now, you're cost constrained, but what's your sense if the United States really wanted to take the lead position? What sort of level of investment do you think would be required to put us in front to catch up?
Well, okay. So that's a great question. well, just, I don't know what the right answer is. I would say that because there's a specific goal with a high payoff, I think investment in there will pay dividends. And because it's a portfolio that could modulate, you can start thinking about more resources. You can pursue parallel paths. So I think today I can sit here and tell you any additional resources put it this goal will bear real fruit, so to speak.
All right, I'd like to turn my next question to Sanjay, because I'm curious, maybe folks in this audience have not read your cost benefit studies and don't know, sort of what the projection for the first unit, nth unit, and then how much you guys requested and how much are you guys actually executed. So sort of what is the scale? And one of the other things you didn't cover is, you had sort of laid out a very ambitious vision for like how much of a contribution to Europe's energy you would hope this could achieve if your R&D turned out. And I just wanted the audience to hear the scale of the ESA ambition.
Sure, Peter. Thanks for the question. So indeed, we did a set of cost benefit analyses last year with our industry. We had two independent contracts to look at what could be the contribution of space-based solar power in the context of our European net zero by 2050 goal. And the way they went about that was to assume some reference architectures, and we used the SBS Alpha architecture as well as the Cassiopeia one from the UK. Each study used one of the two architectures, so they took slightly different approaches to the analysis. They assessed the technical feasibility with the information we have right now, and estimated some costs of the development of these gigawatt scale systems. They were between 1 and 2 gigawatt per satellite, which is typically around the size of a nuclear power station, providing that level of power into the grid 24/7. So they estimated R&D costs and the cost of a first of a kind of the gigawatt scale, as well as a 10th of a kind once the systems can be proven and can be scaled up with duplicates and benefit from the learning factors. So all of this was done in order to then be able to analyze, based on these anticipated costs, how such a new energy source would fit into the future energy mix, acknowledging that there is no one silver bullet to the green transition. It's going to be contributions from existing as well as new energy sources, around solar, wind, nuclear, hydro, and others will all have their roles. And space-based solar power was investigated as a potential contributor as well. Looking at economic arguments purely from a cost competitive perspective, at how it could displace fossil fuels and how it would compete with the other green energy sources. But it also looked beyond economic arguments. What are the strategic benefits and wider societal benefits industrially as well to having this capability. The conclusion of both of these studies were largely similar, which were that the net zero challenge that we have ahead of us is extremely great. There are many scenarios where it is quite possible we will not make it with the existing solutions, because they all have their advantages as well as drawbacks and own constraints for how quickly they can be scaled up. And if such an energy source with the characteristics that space-based solar power has were to be available at competitive prices, then it could have a significant role in accelerating that transition to net zero by 2050. Now, this had to be based on an assumption of how quickly we'd be able to get up to a gigawatt scale, and their estimates were, if we had a decision in 2025 to go ahead with a full development program, we may make it in a step-by-step approach to the gigawatt scale latest by 2040. And that would give us still a decade after that to scale up the systems to a reasonable number in order to provide an appreciable fraction of Europe's clean energy needs in the future. This was estimated to be around 10%, which might not sound like a lot, but this would be a crucial 10% of the electricity because of the base load characteristics, the always on firm power characteristics that this energy source offers, that very well complements the intermittent renewables of solar and wind, which would be the majority of the power. So it really made the case for how this technology would be able to accelerate the energy transition. And they estimated something of the order of 20 to 50 satellites could be developed in time for 2050, providing something like 10% or 800 terawatt hours per year of clean electricity into the grid. So we're not talking about a single satellite, which may cost 10 billion to develop, build, and launch, which, by the way, is of the order of what we spend for nuclear power stations that produce that much power today. But we'd need tens of these in that time frame. So the scale of this to be able to tap into the energy sector, for the space industry to be able to have a role in the energy sector, which is the largest commercial industry in the world, even a small fraction of that would be substantial and be disruptive to the space sector and its industry and its current investments. So I think it was obvious the impact would be large, both environmentally as well as economically, commercially, if this was successful. And what we're trying to do is understand to what extent we can realize that ambition in the time that it matters for climate change, which is in the relatively short term. So we think that agencies like ESA have a role in this early phase to do the de-risking, but ultimately the scale of this is beyond a space agency to deploy. It has to involve larger public institutions and ultimately the private sector to come in and commercialize it. Thanks.
Wonderful. So that bridges, Nick, I wanted to ask you, obviously ESA's taking the position that they have a role in perhaps developing the component technologies, but that actually deploying it is a larger public enterprise. Do you have thoughts on what a potential role for NASA might be?
I actually picked up on something Bucky said about inventing versus innovating, right? And this seems like more of an innovating problem than just invention because of the scale, right? The scale Sanjay's talking about is staggering, and we have to just appreciate that and not be scared of it. But it's that to deploy out systems on that level is not going to be, it cannot be a single government program. It can't be a single government agency. We've talked about things like consortias, where there may be, multiple companies coming in and picking up different pieces. We've heard that like organizations that do things like private equity probably wouldn't touch something like this until it was already of a appreciable scale. So going through the initial development and demonstration, and then some sort of scalable path similar to what James is envisioning, that comes out very, very clearly when you look at this problem. Unlike something like terrestrial solar, where it is a you're printing like sheets of stamps, right, and then you're sending them out everywhere. This is as a colossal integration problem, probably in orbit too. And that's a major challenge we identified, is that in-space assembly. And that's a natural place for several existing government efforts to kind of unify. And, space solar power, in my perspective, is a very good use case of in-space assembly, where you might need things repeatedly stuck together, like magnet tiles, right? Speaking of tiles. And so there's different roles, but how this all comes together into some sort of a lot of past efforts have looked at this and said, what would, if the government just built this whole thing, this is how it would look. And like that is not how we do anything, and it's not how we're going to do anything, I don't think, in the future of this scale. And so we really have to imagine it as, what is the earliest point government can kind of get out of it, and what is that right role as maybe a sponsor, or clearing the way policy wise and a lot of things, and gaining that support. And I would actually like to hear John's thoughts about this because I know he has some.
And in fact, we are going to John. So John, you know, you're of course over in Europe right now, I think, looking for funding. So I want to get two answers from you. One is for your own system, what is the level of financing that it would take in order to get to a prototype or pilot plant system? And second, what do you as a US commercial company think needs to happen in the United States for the United States to come from behind here?
Very good question. And obviously everyone in this space is going to give a slightly different answer. We think our economics are mature enough to forecast the level of detail that you're asking, but to do a small scale commercial pilot, we're talking about flying a 100 kilowatt orbital system in LEO, demonstrate low Earth orbit assembly. And when we say assembly, we don't anticipate manufacturing components in orbit. We imagine taking components manufactured on the ground and then piecing them together. We say like Legos to give people perspective on how simple that is. But we're saying we can build and fly a 100 kilowatt system, including building the ground station, which a lot of people in this space don't recognize how challenging siting and integrating with grid a ground station might involve. But we're already engineering one in West Texas. But total investment and time is only like in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 million to fly a relatively small system. Now, granted, we've designed our architecture from the get-go to be the most economic solution possible. In fact, the studies that the UK did and then Sanjay's team did as a follow-on really was great because it was external validation that our cost forecasting wasn't that far off. In fact, we think this technology is capable of competing globally around providing baseload energy, and not just baseload energy, but displacing fossil fuels. Because if you can get the cost of energy low enough, all the use cases for fossil fuels start to become replaceable with something that's more sustainable. So, you know, on that order of hundreds of millions to build the manufacturing capability, to start building commercial systems. But from our perspective, you know, a couple hundred megawatt system, those are going to be paid by customers. Those aren't going to be development R&D activities, right? Those are commercial products and don't require R&D funding to support. So, you know, tens of millions to do a pilot, hundreds of millions to build the manufacturing capability to build, you know, gigawatt scale systems or megawatt scale systems on the way to gigawatt scale. So those are the, you know, the order of magnitude a commercial entity like mine might pursue. Because to be fair, and Nick and others have said this, that you know, private equity isn't going to fork over $10 billion, for example. But smaller scale is definitely possible and is a reasonable amount to ask. And we've successfully raised enough to do the demonstrators and on the path to doing the balance. And in the course of answering your part of your question, I forgot the second one. Can you give me a quick reminder on what the second half was?
What do you think the United States should do to come from behind?
Great. So as you might know, and we talked about it briefly, the program at AFRL, the program that the Naval Research Lab has been working on wireless power transfer, as well as the Caltech organization, you know, that has been funded privately, are the only funded programs at all in the US, at all. And it's a relatively small amount of funding. I mean, I know how much the AFRL project needs, and mostly that's to buy a rocket, I would imagine. But that's on the scale of, you know, total across everything, 200 million over the last 20 years. I mean, that's a very small amount. But the reason that there isn't any progress in this area is because there's no funding opportunities, sponsorship or otherwise, that space solar power fits into, you know, exactly. So if the government wants to incentivize developments like this, make these technologies eligible for, you know, current funding opportunities and others, and clear the regulatory pathway. Certainly, there is no organization inside the agencies of the government that owns this technology today. The UK government decided that the equivalent of our Department of Commerce needs to own something like this because it is a commercial infrastructure endeavor. So in clearing the regulatory hurdles, which at the moment, only FCC is the only one that would regulate this technology. But there might be some others that pop up later that block us. So making it clear and easy for commercial entities like myself to deploy, and then having a single owner would be great to help navigate all the different things it takes to put large infrastructure in orbit.
Thanks, John. All right, Casey, take us home. I know you've got some ideas
Okay.
for how to fix this.
Andrew, can you show some slides? I just want to say I saw this opportunity, and with New Space Nexus, one of our key areas is really to push, prod, pull, find money, resources to really support game-changing capabilities. And I really believe this is it. And so we'll talk a little bit about the consortium idea next. And really, I know you all have said, like, what's next? The research has been done. There's been demonstrations. And by the way, I know they say Legos. I think of like a little Pez dispenser and then you shift. But anyways, my kids have always loved Pez. So, but anyways, the world is moving on space solar power. And, you know, you heard from Sanjay and others, they're UK, Japan, China. And so it's time for us to move to next slide. I want to show you the UK consortium model. What I found was really surprising is they've really put together a great consortium and partners. And there's 6 US companies in there: Axiom, Virtue Solis, Lockheed Martin, KBR, Deloitte, actually 5 right there that I've listed, but a number of universities, government organizations, and then friendly foreign financing. And it's just an amazing consortium, and we can add to this just the same, or we could put this together too. And as Bucky said, we need to sort of bring this nexus of partners together to do the right thing. Next slide. The consortium fits with the US priorities. These are from the president. Climate and environment, check. Energy, check. Economy, check. National security, check. Restoring America's global standing, check. So I just wanted to show really quick on the next slide. This started the actual commercial fusion energy model was announced last year. And the goal is to realize commercial fusion within a decade. The DOE has stepped up and put multiple grants to for-profit entities. This is my opinion. It needs to start getting to those commercial companies to make something happen. They have $50 million for awardees to deliver the fusion conceptual designs in 18 months. Then they'll do 2-year awards with larger dollars, a little bit of cost share. And then, so as of right now, they've selected 10 projects with 7 private companies owning, totaling 2.3 million. This is a very good model. Next slide. So what I'm saying is, why not something similar to this with a solar power pilot plant? I won't go through this. It's similar to the last one, but really start off with some sort of funding with smaller grants, multiple entities, and then get to the point where we can fund a couple good qualifying performers. And we're looking at following sort of the COTS model, where it's milestone based, simple, points to meet, where you decide where you're going to keep going further or not. Thank you, NASA. So next slide. So I won't go through this too much so we can get a little ahead, but basically four phases where you have the multiple design studies. You put milestone based metrics to meet to getting the funding, but the final part where it's the government contract advanced purchase order, that's really needed. And that's what really made the COTS process work, because it's sort of this sustained contract where the companies, the 1 or 2 qualifying performers can know that they will have a sustained contract. And basically the rewards are very high. As Sanjay was speaking, this is clean, bountiful, predictable power that is there as long as the sun shines. And there's an unbounded clean energy market available to when we do pull this off. It's to me just a no-brainer. Next slide, please. So we're starting to work at pulling together this partnership consortium, and I thought I'd take a little bit of model from my friend Steve Nixon and the founder, I think it's the founder of the hybrid space architect, David Voss. His brother's in the audience, so we'll have to tell him that he needs to come next year because we even named him in this conference. But they came up with the principles and really worked at, hitting the ground, going to speak to various sources, sharing the vision. And so we're going to get to that because I feel the R&D is done. I mean, of course it's not done. I mean, there's still more to do, but we're ready to start getting some significant funding to demonstrate this. And so, like I said, we're going to start there. Next slide. There are a couple public-private partnerships that have been in the works. Of course, our John Mankins, who's been a previous speaker on the Space Industrial Base workshops, has had a number of efforts, and then the National Space Society is working with that. So we look to really kind of help those efforts and keep them moving. Next slide. So why is a consortium needed? One is there's lack of federal agency interest. We need to really keep pushing the cost benefit story for this to be able to get some agency interest. And then we also advocate to Congress for funds. We need to get going on this. So what can this consortium do? We'll bring together the stakeholders to create this industrial base for space solar power. We have a number of entities there that we look to working with. And anyways, I think it's time for the US to move too. So that's ready to go.
Yep. And so at that, our panel, like all the other panels, is over time. And I know that our speakers starting at 11 both have airplanes to catch. So I think it's probably best that everybody takes a really quick 5-minute break and we'll start on time at 11. Is that the plan?
Sounds good. Thank
All
you,
right.
Peter.